loudly and clearly that this crisis must end. Before I recognize our amazing people, and I'll say a couple of words about each one because they helped make this happen and were instrumental, I do want to say personally why I got so involved. In 1943, there was a horrific famine in West Bengal. 3 million people perished. My grandfather at the time was in jail during that famine. And I grew up being told stories of the utter indifference, the indifference of the British and the rest of the world towards that famine, a famine that could have been prevented. And so when I had the opportunity in Congress to try to make a difference, to make sure history doesn't make that same mistake or have that same indifference, I tried to do my part. And there was only one person in the Senate who was willing to introduce the War Powers Resolution, the resolution that we have passed. I mean, it's Senator Sanders introduced this resolution, and with Chris Murphy, who's been such a conscience on Yemen, and Rand Paul, passed this in the Senate after many, many attempts. And it was not an easy route. I'm sure Senator Sanders will talk about that, but we persisted. And now, finally, we'll get this to the President's desk. Before I introduce Senator Sanders, I do want to say that I'm hopeful that the President actually would sign this legislation. We are going to, in good faith, several of us are sending a letter to the President, a bipartisan letter, requesting time to talk to him so that he recognizes that this is a humanitarian issue, not a political issue. This is not to score partisan points. It's to end a humanitarian disaster. With that, I want to introduce the sponsor of the historic War Powers legislation, Senator Bernie Sanders.
Thanks. Today is a big deal, and I want to thank Ro and Jim McGovern and all those in the House who have worked tirelessly on this issue. I want to thank Mike Lee, Chris Murphy, and others in the Senate who understood the importance of what we're doing. Just want to make a few points. What we're seeing now in Yemen is an unparalleled humanitarian disaster. Some 85,000 children have already starved to death as a result of this Saudi-led war. And if we do not act decisively in helping them to rebuild their economy, provide them with humanitarian aid, provide food, not bombs, the situation could become even worse, as Rose said. Second point of importance is the vote in the Senate and in the House makes it clear that the United States will not continue to follow the despotic, anti-democratic leadership coming out of Saudi Arabia. They have their aggressive foreign policy, their aggressive military policy. I think it's a bad idea, but at the very least, the United States should not be led into a war by a despotic, undemocratic, murderous regime. Third point, which applies not only to Yemen, but to the future. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is pretty clear. It is the United States Congress, not the President, who has responsibilities in terms of lawmaking. But tragically, for many years, under Democratic presidents, under Republican presidents, the Congress has abdicated its responsibility. Today, the Congress says we are taking that responsibility back, not just for Yemen, but in the future as well. And the fourth point that I want to make is President Trump has said, appropriately enough, that he wants the United States to get out of endless wars. Well, this war in Yemen has gone on long enough. And if the President wants to keep faith with what he has talked about, I hope very much that he will sign this historic legislation and work with us to make sure that the United States does not continue to be involved in endless and destructive wars. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sanders, again for your incredible moral leadership and having us pass for the first time in history, just again, this War Powers Resolution. So I often say President Trump could be the first president in history to sign a War Powers Resolution. One of the people who has been instrumental, who I look up to, is Jim McGovern for a number of reasons. One, Representative McGovern has been introducing War Powers resolutions on many conflicts and has been standing up to interventionism and was really an instrumental part of our efforts and strategy in the House on Yemen. And he and his team with Don Sisson did an extraordinary job in whipping the votes and making sure we defeated the MTR and made sure that we had the votes. This wouldn't have passed in the House without Chairman McGovern's leadership. So with that, Representative.
Well, first of all, let me thank Ro Khanna for his incredible leadership, and the same holds true for Senator Sanders and Senator Murphy. They have been out front on this, and I'm very, very grateful for their leadership. We're here today because for more than 4 years there has been a Saudi-led, U.S.-supported war in Yemen. And some may dance around the fact by calling it what's happening there a conflict, but let's call it what it is. It's a war. And our involvement in this war is unconstitutional. Nearly all the bombs that have fallen say the same thing: made in the United States of America. They fall on weddings, hospitals, homes, and they fall on funerals, refugee camps, and school buses. It is an aerial bombing campaign that hammers children, families, and civilian neighborhoods each and every day. This is a waking nightmare for the people of Yemen that the United States, sadly, is closely involved in. This Saudi-led war has created one of the worst humanitarian crises on the planet. In Yemen, a child under 5 years old dies every 10 minutes from preventable causes like starvation and disease. If the United States stands for anything, I believe we need to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. I'm the co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in the House, and I believe that this country ought to have a conscience. When we see our government complicit in a humanitarian catastrophe, we have an obligation as citizens to speak up. To imagine what we would do if these children that were caught up to imagine what we would do if it were our children who were caught up in this disaster. And we have an obligation as members of Congress to do everything in our power to make sure our country's action aligns with our values. So no Congress should be complicit in abdicating our constitutional responsibility. Thankfully, this Congress is doing exactly the opposite. We are reasserting our power and saying once and for all that the United States needs to end all support for Saudi Arabia's brutal war in Yemen. And just to emphasize one point that Ro and Bernie have already made, this is the first time in history that a Congress is sending a War Powers resolution to the President. And so today we're not only standing up for the children and the innocent civilians in Yemen, but we are also clawing back our constitutional responsibilities. Thank you.
And I want to introduce Senator Murphy. Before I got to Congress, I had read Senator Murphy's eloquent statements on Yemen. He's been a conscience on this issue before many others were speaking out. Senator Murphy. Thank you, Representative Khanna and Representative McGovern. Representative McGovern has been a paragon of conscience on matters of war and peace for a long time, and I appreciate the path that he paved to today. To Ro and to Bernie, thank you for taking a chance on this resolution and bringing it to fruition. Right and wrong still exists in this world. And it is simply wrong for the United States to be involved in a military campaign that deliberately targets kids in school buses. There is no reason for the United States to be involved in this war in Yemen. It is a humanitarian catastrophe, but it is also a national security catastrophe. Every single day we learn more about how this war is compromising our nation's security. We recently learned that our allies in the Yemen war are taking U.S.-made weapons and transferring them willingly and knowingly to militias and brigades that are associated and affiliated with Al-Qaeda, the very terrorist group that we are supposed to be pursuing inside Yemen. This is a moral stain on this nation every day that we continue to take part in this war, but it is also making this country much weaker. And I'm proud that we are putting this historic piece of legislation on the President's desk. For 2 decades, this Congress has been allergic to getting involved in matters of war and peace abroad. We have fully
abdicated our responsibility to be a co-equal branch for the president in setting the foreign policy of this nation. This resolution is important in its own right. But this resolution is also medicine for that affliction. This resolution gets Congress back into the business of using a muscle that it used to use a lot. That is setting the direction of this country's national security policy alongside the president. If we can do it on as controversial an issue as Yemen and the U.S.-Saudi relationship, then maybe we can do it in other matters of critical national security policy that the president is not acting on or is acting contrary to the best interests of this country. I hope that this is the beginning of a renaissance of congressional action in matters of foreign policy. That may be one of the most important legacies of this vote. To Ro and to Bernie and to Jim, thank you for bringing this to the finish line.
Thank you. I think we have time for a few questions if anyone has them. Go ahead.
This is primarily for Senator Murphy. You're co-sponsor of the Yemen accountability, or the Saudi accountability Yemen bill. You're also ranking member on the Near East Foreign Relations Committee. What do you see prospects for legislation within the committee, and will Mitt Romney encourage or support hearings in a markup of it?
So first, well, this legislation is really about getting the United States out of the Yemen war. It is also a clear message to Mohammed bin Salman about the willingness of this country to stay in business with a regime that has been lying to the United States. I can't speak for my co-sponsors, but I've always seen this resolution as a clear response to the way in which this regime is targeting American residents and then lying to us about what happens to them. As early as yesterday, Senator Risch recommitted himself to passing legislation out of the Foreign Relations Committee that will send a message, a further message to the Saudis about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the continued brutal treatment of political prisoners that they are holding up until this day. But we haven't seen much beyond a rhetorical commitments to that legislation. It's time for Senator Risch to sit down with myself and Senator Menendez and others who want to move that legislation forward and put pen to paper. It's 6 months since Jamal Khashoggi was murdered. It's too late for commitments about future legislation. We need to pass something and pass something fast.
Do you want to say anything? Yes.
Two things real quick. When is the letter that you mentioned going out? And assuming Trump does veto this bill, what are your next steps legislatively? There's possibly the bill that Rachel mentioned, or is there anything else that you might be eyeing to do?
I'll let my colleagues also answer, but first I'm hopeful, given that over 16 Republicans voted with us in the House. Some of the president's closest allies, like Mark Meadows and Matt Gaetz, voted with us. And, of course, there were a number of Republicans in the Senate, like Rand Paul, and seven in the Senate. So this is a bipartisan issue. And at the very least, the president should consider this very seriously and not issue just the second veto of his term. I mean, Congress has spoken overwhelmingly. Many of his allies have joined in this effort, and so we are going to do everything we can to get the president to sign it. Second, if he doesn't sign it, it's still an extraordinary statement, and there are steps that his administration can take to put pressure on the Saudis to lift the blockade. Secretary Mattis had made a call after the Senate first passed the resolution that Martin Griffiths has talked about publicly to the Saudis that was helpful to get the ceasefire in Hodeidah. I hope that the administration will take further steps to put pressure on the Saudis to lift the blockade and allow food and medicine in, and to fully fund the $4.5 billion that's necessary, according to Griffiths, for the Yemeni civilians. Finally, there are other legislative steps, and I'll let my colleagues also speak to them about looking at arms sales to the Saudis and considering the alliance that we have and re-examining that. Senators, do you want to?
Well, not a whole lot. You know, the president has appropriately enough, I don't agree with Trump on very much, but he has appropriately enough talked about the need for the United States to get out of endless wars. Well, if he wants to be consistent, he wants to be honest, for a change, he might want to sign this resolution. Because what we are saying now is that we have been there for 4 years, that this war effort is being led by an undemocratic, despotic, lying regime that we should not be following. And I hope he does sign it. I sincerely do hope that he does sign it. Okay, thank you.
Senator Sanders, question for you, sir. It's been about 6 weeks since you pledged that you would release 10 years of your tax returns. Can you talk about what is the holdup at this point? And
Actually,
when do you
not.
expect to do
We'll
that?
have more information on that. Today, let's worry about the starving children in Yemen. I know you're concerned about it.
And let me just add to what we just said. I mean, if the president decides to veto this, we're not going away. I mean, there are other legislative vehicles. I have a bill that would end all military assistance and arms sales to the Saudi government. I think that's an appropriate step we should take. This government has one of the worst human rights records of any government in the world, and the fact that the United States continues to sell them weapons, I think is unconscionable. So we will continue this effort no matter what, but we do hope that the president will have a moment of clarity and sanity and maybe a moment of conscience and do the right thing. I mean, human rights ought to matter, and the people around the world look to us as the leader on the issue of human rights. It'd be nice if this president would lead for once.
I do want to say that a lot of times, it's the members of Congress and senators who get to claim credit for a win. But this win was for two reasons. One was a lot of the grassroots groups that around the country have been mobilizing for the past 2.5 years. And I don't want to list them all because I may exclude one of them, but it shows the power of grassroots mobilization. And two, I think Representative McGovern would agree, the staff has been extraordinary. They've been pushing people on my team, Gio Saba and Keen Bott and Don Sisson and Shawanza Goff and Keith Stern. They really have been pushing this for the last 2.5 years. So I just want to recognize those efforts. Thank you.
I didn't have any problems. It could be like your cable, maybe.